Hello there. My name is Doug Allen, and I'm an economist. And I'm creating this video for just ordinary people who would like to know a little bit about the facts of COVID-19. The video is kind of long, and I appreciate that nobody wants to listen to an economist for an hour. But the outline of what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to start talking about modeling issues, issues of benefits and costs of lockdown. Then I'm going to move on to facts about cases and deaths and COVID mortality that's been going on for the last 20 months. Then I'm going to talk about vaccines and vaccine passports. I'll move on to masks and mask mandates. I'm going to talk about long COVID, and I'm going to finish up with Omicron. So if you just want to skip ahead because you only care about mask mandates, you can just go ahead and skip ahead. It should be reasonably continuous. I'm first question you might ask is, what does an economist have to say about COVID? What kind of authority do I have? And economists are trained in many ways, and we're trained in mathematics, and so we can understand the epidemiological models that are being used. We're also trained in statistics, and so we have no problem understanding the empirical work that surrounds this. And perhaps most importantly, we're trained in understanding that there are benefits and costs to actions. And so we have training in how to measure those benefits and how to measure those costs and how to compare them and those sorts of things. Now, for me personally, I've been doing research on COVID since it started. And in this past year, I published a paper that examined over 120 studies, I think, looking mostly at the cost of lockdown. And that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to give a very brief summary of that paper. If you're interested in seeing the original report that I wrote and posted online in April, you can just Google my name, Doug Allen, and lockdown report, and that link should come up and you can read that. Or there's the address right there. Or if you wanted to read the published version of that paper, there is the address for that paper. And so you can go ahead and read that. I've been struck by the wide range of disagreement over COVID factual issues among friends and families and colleagues and pretty much almost anyone you meet. You can find people that are way over here or people that are way over there. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, one, many of us have differences of opinion over how strongly and consistently we should be obedient to the state. If the state declares that we should do something, some people might think that no matter what, we should obey, and others would say almost no matter what, we should not obey. And most of us fall in between there. I am not going to talk about that at all. For many of us, we have different personal situations. Some of us have health issues. Some of us are perfectly fine. Other people may have family members that are at risk. And of course, every one of us has different risk tolerances. Some of us can't tolerate any risk, and some of us are literally risk takers. I'm not going to address any of those issues either. What I am going to address is I want to talk about our differences in our assessments of these risks and our differences in facts. And so where we should not have disagreement is over what actually has happened. And if you have a big misunderstanding about how many people die when they get infected with COVID, that's going to have a huge impact on the kind of opinion you have. And so I'm hoping that if we can come to some agreement on what the actual risks are and the facts are, that this might help for some more common ground. I've been really struck by how many ordinary people still, after 20 months, have actually very little understanding of the COVID facts. And I've been asking even some of my own students some basic factual questions, and I've been relatively surprised at the answers that I've been getting. And so again, my issue here is to lay out key facts and hope that people can make an informed opinion. I am not here to take a position. I'm certainly not going to deny that COVID-19 exists. I had it myself. I'm not going to provide theories or anything like that. And I'm mostly going to try and focus in on the facts. Let's just start right at the beginning. And COVID-19 first was reported in Wuhan, China in January of 2020. We still do not know why it arrived. Did it get leaked from a lab in Wuhan? Or was it the result of a crossover from animals, namely bats? There's really evidence for both of those theories, but nothing conclusive. And so I think there's not much use in feeling too strongly about where it came from. What we do know is that on March 11th of 2020, the World Health Organization declared a worldwide pandemic. And what followed was something that was extremely unusual. And, in my lifetime, I've certainly never seen anything like it. So despite standard health practices, the lockdown was not a normal procedure. Despite standard health practices, nation after nation adopted one form of lockdown or stay-at-home order or some type of restriction in an attempt initially to contain the virus and then in an attempt to limit transmissions. Now, you can have all kinds of theories about why that happened. Not going to get into those, but certainly one element that played into it was the use of what are called SIR or SIRS models. This is a type of model in epidemiology. And in particular, there was a group of people from the Imperial College of London who were early in policy circles were promoting these models. And I think it's very important to understand a little bit about these models, to understand why there was such a dramatic and exceptional response to COVID-19. This is a table from my paper. These numbers are coming from the Empirical College of London model. I'm only going to look at Canada, but you can see numbers there for UK, US, and Sweden. What these models were predicting was that if Canada did nothing, just had a let it rip strategy towards the virus, that 266,000 people would die by the end of July of 2020. That's only 4 months away. To put that into context, during that time, the total all-cause mortality in Canada would be somewhere around 72,000. So basically what was happening is that it looked like a virus was coming that singularly would have caused 4 times the level of death. That's terrifying. The model also predicted that if the country went into extreme lockdown, every single individual was isolated and stayed at home, that the best we could hope for was 132,000 people would die. And you might remember in March and April of 2020, we shut down the hospitals to all other procedures outside of emergency procedures. And we waited. We set up field hospitals across North America and Europe, and we waited for this onslaught of fatalities. You might remember at the time that we had these at 6 p.m., people would go out and bang their pots and pans in honor of the doctors who are going to be treating these massive numbers of deaths. But of course, the deaths never came. The patients never came. By July of 30, instead of having 266,000 people die or 132,000 people die, only 9,000 people died. That model for Canada was off by a factor of almost 15. That's about almost as wrong as you can get in terms of a prediction. You can imagine an economist who predicts, a 1% increase in interest rates in the coming year, and the interest rates change by 15%. If you paid for that report, you would demand your money back. Even by December of 2021, which we're in right now, we're just under 30,000. So we're still not even close to the total number of people that died. So this is just a fact. We entered into our pandemic phase thinking that it was apocalyptic. And we've discovered that it's not, that deaths are nothing like what were predicted. Now, it's still a question that we need to address. Is 30,000 people a lot of people or not? But it's nothing like what was predicted. When you look at these SIRS models, you've seen pictures like this. The black line there is showing that if the government does nothing, this is going to be the path of the virus. The virus will enter the population very rapidly, will get exponential spread. Eventually, everyone becomes infected, and the virus then, with no one else to infect, falls down into what's called an endemic state. The virus doesn't go away, but it has very few people left that it can infect. If the government does some kind of lockdown policy, it doesn't eliminate the fact that everybody is going to get infected, but it spreads it out more. So fewer people are infected initially, but more people are infected later on. And we all know exactly what this is. This is called bending the curve, right? And bending the curve, the purpose of this is to allow your hospital system time to deal with all these deaths and not be overwhelmed by a single wave. So keep that in mind. This model is based on a set of assumptions. And very quickly, what these assumptions are is that they assume that everybody is 100% susceptible. And so the virus is a novel virus. It's something that our bodies have never seen before and have no immunity towards. The second thing is that these models initially assumed, the ICL model, assumed that the reproduction number was 2.4. The reproduction number is a very important number in these models. It's what's giving you this explosive growth. And so a reproduction number of 2.4 means that if I'm infected, I'm going to infect 2.4 people. But each one of those people will also affect 2.4 people. And so you get a doubling and then a doubling and then doubling, and then, very shortly the whole world is infected. The second thing that these models assumed, the ICL model initially, was that the infection fatality rate of the people who are infected, what fraction of them died, it assumed that the infection fatality rate was 0.9%, almost 1%. So almost 1% of people that get infected are going to die. And then finally, a critical assumption in these models, I call it the zombie assumption. These models assume that the humans that are going about and being infected by the virus never change their behavior. They're just like rocks that get pushed over a ledge and just fall based on the laws of gravity. So if a person is going to the store 5 times a week and slapping hands and hugging their friends and giving kisses and all those kinds of things, when this deadly virus is around, they do exactly the same thing. They never respond. Now, I can't go into a lot of detail, but I can say that every single one of these assumptions is false. They're wrong, and they're wrong by a large margin. So in terms of the susceptibility, it depended on which country you looked at, but it's quite possible that up to 60% of the people were not susceptible, that they had been infected by some previous coronavirus that was relatively close to the alpha variant of the COVID-19 illness. And so they had memory cells and T cells that were sufficient, maybe not to stop infection, but certainly sufficient not to die. And so it wasn't really a novel virus for everyone. Secondly, the reproduction number, the R value, as I'm going to show you in a minute, this number is not exogenous. It doesn't fall from heaven. This number depends on human behavior. And very quickly, that R value falls to 1. So one person infects another person who infects another person. This is what's called the endemic state. This is sort of the steady state that all viruses end up in. The infection fatality rate. So our best estimate of the infection fatality rate on average is 0.15%. Your average flu season, the infection fatality rate is about 0.05 to 0.1%. So COVID turned out to be about either in the neighborhood of 3 times more deadly than the flu, or maybe just only 50% more deadly than the flu. Now, a lot of people have a very negative response to this again, fact. And you might hear various public health officials say things like, what flu ever killed 700,000 people in the United States? But here's where you have to be very careful. When we compare how lethal something is, how lethal COVID-19 is to, say, a flu, we look at a rate of infection. We say, of the people who are infected, how many died? That's a big lot different than saying, oh, look at, there were 700,000 people killed. And the reason why you can't really look at the level of death and compare it to the rate is that, if suppose many more people get infected by COVID that get infected by the flu. If many people get infected and it is more lethal, you could end up with a massive high number of total deaths. And total deaths matter, and certainly total deaths matter for hospital capacity, etc. But just comparing total deaths with infection rates, that's comparing apples to oranges. And so you have to watch out for that kind of rhetoric. And finally, of course, the zombie assumption is completely false. And that's the one that I want to look at just very briefly. There was several economists at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. Atkinson was the head author. And they discovered early on in the summer of 2020 the following. And so they were looking at all countries, all states that had experienced an invasion of COVID and had experienced deaths. And they found this. So the black line here, this is their estimate across all these countries. This is what is happening to the reproduction number 20 days, 40 days, 60 days after the first death. And what happened, and again, this is across all countries doing all kinds of different things, is that the virus behaved. The red and blue lines are sort of the confidence bands. So virtually all the countries are within those bands. The virus behaved basically the same way across all the countries, that within 20 days, the reproduction number, it might have started, being crazy, but within 20 days, it settles down to 1. And then it stays there. That's really quite remarkable when you think about it. That means you're not going to get this explosion of cases that these models predicted. Now, you can actually go look this up on Our World in Data. You can go to Our World in Data. You can pick whatever country you want, and you can ask, graph the reproduction number R over time. And here I've just graphed the United States and Canada, and you can see initially they were kind of very high numbers, but whoosh, they settle down around 1 very quickly. And, sometimes it's above, sometimes it's below. Here's the Delta situation. And basically what's happening, this is an endemic state that's being driven by human behavior. When the virus becomes active and the reproduction number is above 1, people become cautious, they stay home, they're more careful, reproduction number falls. When the reproduction number falls below 1, people respond by having parties and going around other people, etc., like that. And we're in an equilibrium, basically, of what's going on. Here's if I wanted to graph the world. You see at the world, it's the same. It really doesn't matter how you graph it. It always comes out the same. It's quite remarkable. But the fact that it's remarkable just shows you how far off those models were. They completely missed understanding this. If you add this kind of behavior into these models, which Atkinson has done, those models don't predict anything like an apocalyptic number of deaths. The other thing to realize here is that we have been in an endemic state since April of 2020. Think about that for a minute. This is sort of the reason why, the fact that the virus behaves the same across all the countries, regardless of whether they were serious lockdown countries or were not or had minor, didn't matter what the stringency index was for these countries, the results are sort of the same. So again, here I'm just, looking at the cumulative deaths. So the total number of deaths at any given time per million of population. And I just looked at, here's North America and the European Union. And as of December of 2021, we've kind of ended up at the same place. So Canada did not have the same policies of the United States or Mexico. And we had different policies across Sweden and England and Germany and Austria and all these various places. And yet, if we just look at the continental things, we've ended up in the same place. Now, at any given time, either Europe or North America there were more deaths going on, but it really didn't make any difference. Now, Sweden, initially, for constitutional reasons, was not allowed to lock down as hard as other countries and came under serious criticism from around the world because they initially experienced a lot more deaths than Europe did as a whole. There are other countries that did worse, but they come under big fire. But look what's happened over time. Sweden has ended up better off than the European Union. And they basically missed, their deaths have been flat, and they basically missed Delta. And what's likely the reason for that is because so many people were infected with Alpha in the 2020 that they had enough natural immunity to avoid being killed by Delta. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is that the panic that we had turned out to be not justified, and that the lockdown strategies did not work. They really made no difference in terms of the total number of deaths, infections, etc. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, in my community, deaths and cases started to go up. We put on a lockdown and they came down. And what I'm telling you is that the empirical work shows that they would have come down anyway. They would have come down anyway. Now, I conclude in that paper that lockdown is the greatest peacetime policy disaster in history. And I do that because I cannot think of anything that comes close. So on the one hand, we engage in all these lockdown behaviors pretty much for nothing. There were some small effects of lockdown, but they came early on and they came with small levels of lockdown. Any place that had serious lockdown or extended lockdowns, the lockdown had no benefit on deaths averted or anything like that. On the other hand, we know that there are incredible amounts of costs to COVID. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but you can refer to the paper. But there was lost GDP. People were unemployed. Things didn't get built, didn't get made. And there was a serious loss of wealth through that. There were lost educational opportunities and the consequences of that. And this is one of the, I think, the tragedies of COVID-19 is that older people were vulnerable, but younger people bore the brunt of the cost. And people that were in, elementary school or secondary school, they will suffer consequences for the rest of their life for the lost year and a half of education that they had. There are increased deaths and reduced life expectancy due to the increased unemployment. Unemployment leads to lower income leads to worse health, and worse health leads to earlier death. There are increased deaths of despair, deaths of suicide, deaths of overdoses, those sorts of things. There was increased domestic violence, there was family breakdown, loss of social capital, all sorts of things like that. There was something what economists call the Peltzman effect. So in 2020, when we locked down hospitals and shut out other patients, people did not get their cancer treatment. They did not get diagnosed with cancer. They missed their cancer test. And of course, when we scared people and they wouldn't go to hospitals, would not go see their doctor, who may only been operating by a phone anyway, again, the same thing. And it looks like these deaths are much larger than the total number of COVID deaths. And in fact, almost every one of those categories, if you convert those costs to deaths, almost every one of those categories, we had more deaths caused by the reaction to COVID than COVID itself. In my paper, I conclude this. I conclude that for every 80-year-old that we avoided death by lockdown, if you add up all the costs, we killed 141 others. That's why it's I think the greatest policy disaster. The cost-benefit ratio is 141. If you're from British Columbia and you remember back 20 years, we had a fast ferry fiasco that brought down a government. And there the cost-benefit ratio was about 3. And yet here we're talking about a cost-benefit ratio of 141. Now, we are not in lockdown anymore, and I don't think we will generally have big lockdowns because I think everybody has understood that they're extremely costly, really catastrophic in terms of costs. And so even if you think they have some benefit, nobody can justify them in terms of cost, but they likely have no benefit anyway. So one way to think about where we're at in the pandemic is in terms of cases. And so here's the number of, oops, I didn't want to do that. Here are the number of cases in 2020, in the spring of 2020. Not very many cases. In the fall of 2020, cases exploded. And then if you remember after Christmas last year, they completely collapsed around the world. That happened. And then again in the late spring, we had another wave of cases. And then this last late summer, early fall, we had a Delta variant wave. So we say we've seen 4 waves. Looking at cases is not really a very good way of understanding the pandemic. Not a good way for 2 reasons. One, the number of cases depends on how many people are being tested, and the number of people being tested is not constant over time. Secondly, whether or not someone tests positive for COVID depends on what's called the cycle threshold. How many cycles does the PCR test go through? If the PCR test only goes through 20 cycles, it's almost certainly going to find a negative result. If it goes through 40 cycles, it's almost certainly going to find a positive result. There's something in your system that, if you look closely enough, looks a little bit like a coronavirus. We don't know if these cycle thresholds have been constant across countries, constant across provinces or states, nor do we know that in a given jurisdiction if the cycle threshold has been constant or constant across different parts of the jurisdiction. We just don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But without knowing that, looking at the case numbers really doesn't tell you very much. So what can we do? We can do a couple things. One, we can look at the number of, so this first graph here, these are the cases again. We come over here, these are the new tests, or the number of tests that have been being conducted over time. And you can see that testing increased dramatically over 2020. Then it collapsed earlier this year and it increased during Delta. So the number of people that are being tested was increasing. You shouldn't be too surprised that maybe you're going to catch more cases. So one way to look at this is to look at, of the cases that you tested, what fraction of them tested positive. And this is what's caused the positive test rate or the case infection rate. And you see what happened. So even in 2020, we had very few cases, but of those cases, 14, 15% of them were testing positive. That was in the early part of the pandemic. You see much later on that the other waves, the fraction of people that were being tested positive is much lower than it was then, and it's sort of generally been falling. This is our reproduction graph again. Now, in terms of deaths, I think this is maybe where we should really focus some attention. We said earlier that only 9,000 people died by July 30th, and now there have been 30,000 people almost that have died. If we look at the daily number of confirmed deaths across the pandemic, we see that initially the daily deaths were quite high in the first wave, quite high in the second, but then we get vaccines. And once we get vaccines, there was a collapse in the Alpha variant cases, and new variants came along that hit us in the late spring, and then we had Delta. But look what's happening to the number of deaths per day. They're far lower than they ever were before. And on what's this, December 3rd, on December 3rd, only 20 people in the entire country died of COVID. Now you might think, wow, 20 people, that's a lot. We are a country of 38 million people. Every day, approximately 1,000 people die of something. So 20 is not actually a big number. Now, the other thing you might note that nobody talks about the average age of death anymore. And I've been trying to find it and I can't. And we know that over the early part of the pandemic, that the average age of death was around 83. But I rather wonder if what the average age of death is now. Of these 20 people, were they all above 85? Were they over 90? I mean, it's something that the government is not making available very easily. One other way we can talk about deaths is to look at what's called excess mortality. Excess mortality is looking at, in any given month of any given year in any given place, there's an expected number of people that are going to die. And excess mortality is when there's deaths over what is expected. And when you look at this graph, you can see, wow, in the early part of the pandemic, in March, April of 2020, we had a lot of excess deaths. A number of people have looked into this, because this happened, of course, around the world. And it's hard to see on this graph because it doesn't include 2019, but you can see from 2019, excess deaths were very low. And it looks like part of the reason why the first wave of the virus was so deadly was not only was it novel for many people, but there were a lot of people that would have died in 2019, but 2019 was an exceptionally late flu season. And so they did not die. And then they died from COVID in 2020. There were excess deaths throughout the summer and fall of 2020. But the interesting thing of these excess deaths is most of these excess deaths are occurring in people that are under 60. And these people are not dying of COVID. And so these are likely a lot of the Peltzman effect deaths, people that missed their cancer appointment, didn't get their cancer diagnosed or whatever. So even though we have excess deaths here, a lot of these excess deaths have to be attributed to lockdown, not to COVID. Now look what's happened since the introduction of vaccines. Excess deaths collapse. They're way low throughout the summer, and throughout the fall, they've basically been zero. Now we have this spike here. I have no idea what this is. I assume it's probably a coding error of some type, but whatever it was, it immediately falls back down. So I have no idea what's going on there. But if we ignore this as probably a likely error, basically for 2021, the people who have been dying are people that would have died anyway. People who would have died anyway. Nothing exceptional happened in 2021 in terms of death, right? In terms of death. Now, the other last thing you need to know about deaths and COVID is COVID has what's called a natural mortality. COVID-19 is killing people with the same probability as they would have of dying anyway. So if you're 10 years old, it's very unlikely that you're going to die. But if you're 10 years old, it's very unlikely you're going to die from COVID. And so here we've got the probability of dying of COVID based on your age category. And you can see that until you're 60 years old, really not much is happening. And so COVID is really not a serious illness for people that are under 60. Sure, some people die. There's no question about that. But in terms of the infection fatality rate, if you're 25 and you get infected by COVID, your probability of dying is extremely low. On the other hand, if you're over 70, then COVID becomes a serious factor in your death. And if you're over 90, your probability of dying is quite high. Of course, the probability of dying when you're over 90 is pretty high anyway. If we extend this graph out to 110, you have a 100% probability of dying. So back to infection fatality rate. The first thing to realize is that the average infection fatality rate is about 0.15%. That means that people who get COVID, of all the people who get COVID, 99.85% of them are expected to survive. 99.85% of the people are expected to survive. I asked someone the other day about what did they think their chance of survival was if they got COVID. This was somebody that was in their 20s. They said, I think I have a 95% chance of living, a 5% chance of dying. I mean, they're off by, a huge order of magnitude. When people die of COVID, they really mostly die with COVID. And what that means is that these are people that are not only very old, but they're very sick. And the average number of illnesses that they have, these comorbidities, is 4. If you're 50 years old, you probably don't have any comorbidities. But these people have 4. Currently, the most common comorbidity is dementia, which again is something that affects mostly very elderly people. And so a lot of people think it's much more correct to say that people die with COVID, not that they die of COVID. Of the people who die of COVID, only about 4% have no comorbidities. The other thing to point out, I think I mentioned it already, is that the average age of death in Canada over the first year of the pandemic was 83. The average life expectancy in Canada is 81. People that are dying of COVID have already outlived the average life expectancy of the average Canadian. So what do we conclude from this? COVID is not the Grim Reaper. We thought it was going to be something like smallpox or Ebola or something like that. It's nothing like that. It is worse than the flu, the average flu, no question. Even though there have been 5 or 6 flus in the past 50 years that have been worse than COVID, it's worse than the average flu. But it's not the Grim Reaper. And so we should not be terrified of dying from COVID, especially if you're under 60 years of age. Vaccines. So a couple of things that you need to know about the coronavirus. Uh, Unlike something like smallpox has been the greatest killer in human history. More people have died of smallpox than anything else. And it's not until the 19th century that we get a smallpox vaccine. And since that time, we have been able to isolate smallpox, as it only exists in laboratories now. And the reason why we're able to do that is because smallpox only exists in humans. A coronavirus does not exist just in humans, it exists in animals as well. And so it's constantly crossing back and forth. And this is true about the flu virus as well. And so we can never isolate it and eliminate it. Coronaviruses have been around for as long as humans have been around, and they will never go away. Never, ever. So if you think that somehow by behaving a certain way, you're helping the cause of zero COVID or eliminating COVID, you're really fooling yourself. It's never going to happen. The other thing about coronavirus is that it's always mutating. And almost everybody knows this now because we've gone through the alpha, the beta, the lambda, the delta variant, now the Omicron variant. We've learned this firsthand, but we've known this forever that the coronavirus constantly mutates, which is why we've known for at least 100 years that you're never going to develop a single vaccine that can protect you. We have a vaccine for the alpha variant, extremely effective in preventing infection by the alpha variant. The breakthrough infection rate for the alpha variant, I believe, was around 0.08%. The infection fatality rate for the alpha variant was practically zero. So if you received the vaccine, you were not going to get infected by alpha. You saw that in those graphs above where cases just collapse in January, February, December. But the other thing is that you weren't going to die. But as the virus evolves, your vaccine is no longer effective. No longer effective in preventing infection. For quite some time, it will be very effective in preventing you from getting seriously ill. So we're never going to have a single vaccine. We'll constantly have to have vaccines over and over again. Now, me personally, I'm not against vaccines. I was vaccinated with AstraZeneca. That AstraZeneca was for the alpha variant. But I got the Delta variant in November of 2021, just a month or so ago. It was a 5-day cold. I'd give it a 4 out of 10. I've had much worse. It wasn't fun, but it wasn't awful. So my vaccine was unable to prevent infection, but it was effective in keeping me from getting sick. So there's no such thing as zero COVID. It's never going to happen. We have been in an endemic state since April 2020, and we will continue to go to that endemic state. Eventually, that endemic state will become a biological one, not a behavioral one. That means that I'm going to get infected again. You are going to get infected either for the first time or the second time or the third time, and that's okay. Indeed, that's the way human beings have always dealt with coronavirus. The way we've always dealt with coronavirus is that every year we get a cold. And when you get a cold, you become immune to that cold virus, which protects you from death from the next cold virus, but it's not good enough to protect you from the next cold virus because that virus had mutated a little bit and has escaped your immunity. I personally think that it is better to become infected sooner rather than later, unless you are a vulnerable person. If you're 83 years old, you don't want to get infected. But if you're my age and you're healthy, by getting infected earlier, what happens is that my vaccine is more effective because the virus has not had a large amount of time to mutate, and I'm a younger person. The longer I wait, the less effective my vaccine is, and the older I am. The thing you need to realize about booster shots is that the booster is not a vaccine against Delta. It's not a vaccine against Omicron. It's just another alpha shot. Alpha has been gone since May. There is no alpha variant around. And so unless you're old or immunocompromised, and if you're old or immunocompromised, it means that your body is going to forget the information that it received from your vaccine and the reaction to it. There's just no point in getting a booster, right? No point. And something I think we should think about is if a young person in Canada gets the booster shot, which has zero benefit to him, that takes away that vaccine from somebody in the third world who has not received a vaccine yet. They're still waiting for their first vaccine. Is it morally right to deny somebody their first vaccine when the benefit of some of you is zero to get the third one? Now, again, if you're a vulnerable person and you're 80 years old, I wouldn't feel guilty at all about getting the booster shot. But for the rest of us, I think there's something that we need to think about. Vaccine passports. The idea of the vaccine passports is it was targeted really at the vaccinated. It was the government's attempt to convince the vaccinated that they could return to a sports venue, to a restaurant, to a movie theater, whatever, some place where there'd be lots of people, and they could be confident that everybody there had been vaccinated, and therefore everybody there was not infected, and therefore it's a safe place. Let's keep out the unvaccinated. That is the idea behind the vaccine passport. And if the virus had stayed as the alpha variant, that would make some sense, right? Because anybody who's vaccinated is not going to get infected with the alpha variant, and away you go. But of course, things change. The vaccinated do get infected. Now, we don't know the rate of their infection because we don't know all the people that get infected who have been vaccinated. Why don't we know that? The thing is that when people are vaccinated, they're more likely to be asymptomatic, or they're more likely just to have very mild symptoms, and why bother getting a test? And so if most people who are vaccinated and infected don't get tested, but most people who are unvaccinated and get infected do get tested, then just looking at the number of people who were tested positive and vaccinated is going to be an underestimate of the total number of vaccinated people who are infected. It's quite possible that the infection rate on Delta was the same for people who are vaccinated and who are unvaccinated. What's different is how they respond to that infection. So the infected vaccinated person also transmits the virus at the same rate as the unvaccinated person. So if I'm vaccinated and I got COVID, I'm physically just as likely to transmit it as somebody who is unvaccinated. So what this means is that whether or not vaccine passports are a good idea or not is an empirical question. You could end up in a room with vaccinated people and have 10% of them infected, and you don't even know they're infected because they're asymptomatic. The unvaccinated, will probably more likely know that they're infected because they're symptomatic, and they're less likely to show up. Or if they do show up, you can see that they're coughing and hacking and stay away from them. So if vaccinated infected people are more dangerous, it's not clear that vaccine passports are a good thing. And certainly if the infection rate is the same, they're definitely a bad thing. And so again, before you plant your flag too strongly on vaccine passports, you need to recognize this conundrum, that it's really an empirical question. And if we don't know the answer, we should show a little grace and respect and compassion's the wrong word, but understanding towards others who maybe are opposed to vaccine passports. It's not clear that they're a good idea. Masking. So the first thing to know about masking is that the evidence on its effectiveness for transmission is weak. There's not really very few random control trials on masking. And many people question whether we've actually created a random control trial that's even relevant. to transmission. There are various other types of empirical work done on masking, and the best you can say is that the results are mixed. Some find it reduces transmission, some finds it doesn't. And to the extent there is an effect, it's tiny. And when it comes to wearing these blue masks or your cloth mask or some kind of non-surgical mask, these things are almost useless, right? The virus is so small that it evades those masks completely. So, yeah, to the extent there is an effect, it's small, especially for non-surgical masks. What strikes me about it as an economist, it strikes me that there's just so much ritual and superstition around masking that it's become sort of normal behavior to mask, even in contexts that make absolutely no sense. You're in a room full of vaccinated people who have had COVID, and yet we're still wearing masks. You're outside riding a bicycle and people are wearing masks, or they're inside a car by themselves and they're wearing a mask. A lot of this, I think, is virtue signaling. You're saying, I care about people or something like this, or whatever. But again, the evidence for the medical evidence or reasons for masking is not strong. Now, something to think about it. Suppose masking really did reduce transmission. Let's suppose it really had a big effect. If they do risk infection, remember, the virus never goes away. You are standing in line and you will be infected. And so the question is, if you delay infection by 5 or 6 years, what's going to happen? You will eventually become infected by a virus that your immune system, either through the vaccine you had or some past infection, is so far removed from what you're about to get infected with that what you're going to get infected with 5 years from now is really another novel virus. And so rather than having a novel virus show up once every 100 years, maybe we're going to have one every 5 years go through this. So rather than getting infected constantly and having it amount to nothing more than a cold, you're going to get hit less often, but much more severely, right? The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to be older. Now, if you're 21 years old, that's no big deal. But if you're my age and you're 61 and now you're going to be 66, that might make a big difference, right? So it's just like with the vaccine mandates. It is an empirical question whether masking is a good or a bad policy. And if it's an empirical question and we don't know the answer, how confident should you be to plant your flag and say, I will not associate with anybody who masks or anybody who does not mask, etc. Again, we should show, I think, a little bit more reason and understanding and respect for one another. Long COVID. Don't have much to say about long COVID because first thing is we know almost nothing about it. There have been a few studies about it, but they're not well done in particular. And when people have gone back and re-examined the samples, they've discovered that many of the participants never even had COVID. So if you never had COVID, you certainly never had long COVID. And again, suppose there is such a thing as long COVID, and why wouldn't there be? I mean, some people are going to experience the virus in a way that's more serious than others, and those serious effects might last. That's a cost. And so we have to weigh any action we take to avoid that cost. We need to weigh, the benefits of that. Omicron. So here it is, December. Omicron's been around the news now for almost 2 weeks. First thing, of course, we know very little. There is no point in getting too bent out of shape, running one way or the other, if we don't know much. It's a new variant. Surprise. We're going to continually get new variants because that's what a coronavirus does. So nobody should be surprised that there's a new variant. That's not interesting. What I find interesting about it is, in the news, it's reported that this is very transmissible, more transmissible than Delta, which was much more transmissible than the others. What do we know about transmission? It's almost impossible to measure transmission in real time. And if Omicron had the transmission rate that people are claiming, I mean, it's sort of astronomical. R values of 50 or something. What it seems like what Omicron is doing is it's evading the vaccine. So people that it's infecting, people that are vaccinated, have little protection against against Omicron. Now that sounds like it's terrible, but often it's very common when viruses mutate that they become more transmissible, but with less serious consequences. The way the virus is going to survive is to not kill its host so much. Viruses that are too lethal kill their host too quickly and they can't spread. And so it seems like the seriousness is too low. And here's just a little bit of data. This is from South Africa, where the virus is coming out of. And looking at the same stage of the Delta wave compared to the Omicron wave, it looks like in terms of patients with a ventilator or patients in the ICU or patients in the hospital, it's looking like Omicron is far less deadly. Now, again, if you go back to the death graphs that we looked at, Delta was not particularly deadly either, especially for the vaccinated. So think about this. Before you panic about Omicron, think could be nature's vaccine. So reportedly with Omicron, the most serious effect is that people get an ache in their arm, kind of like they had a vaccine. But if Omicron spreads very quickly and kills no one and has very little harmful impacts, that's fantastic. That's like giving everybody natural immunity, which is much better than a vaccine anyway. And so maybe this is good news, and maybe things will end very quickly. Let's hope so. Some last thoughts. COVID-19, for the vast majority of people, is not particularly dangerous. From the beginning, I knew I was in good health and I was not over 70. I was never afraid of COVID. COVID might kill me, but I might die of 100 things, including getting in my car and driving down the road. So there are risks all around us, and COVID-19 is not an exceptionally high risk. Evidence is we can't contain the virus, nor can we eliminate it. So let's not worry about somebody engaging some behavior that we think is not stopping the virus. We cannot stop the virus. That opportunity, that little tiny window, is long, long gone. The virus is here to stay. The variants will continue. Don't be surprised if there's an Eta or an Theta or whatever the next Greek letter it's going to be. But also don't be surprised that the virus is going to become less lethal. That's just sort of the natural path of all viruses. The last thing to take away, any type of restriction you place on people is extremely costly. When you take people's education and their jobs and their livelihoods away, when you take away their entertainment, their reason for living, their visits to their other people, when you isolate people, these things have massive, massive consequences. When you shut down a church that's doing all kinds of social welfare in their community, when you shut down that church that is bringing people together every week, it might be their only contact with other people. This has massive social consequences. And so we need to be very cautious, I think, about doing these sorts of things. And just because you might think that wearing a mask is no big deal, doesn't mean that for other people it's not not a big deal. And as I pointed out earlier, it's an empirical question whether it's a good public health policy or not. And vaccine passports and mask mandates are not dominant strategies. Dominant strategies means we're going to go ahead with them no matter what. Well, that's not true, because the underlying assumptions below these things are not necessarily true. So our different opinions reflect more our personality traits and our assessment of these risks and these facts. And if our assessment of the risks and the facts are way off, then we're going to have opinions out here. So I hope I've talked a little bit about these facts in a way that maybe you've learned something. If you want to contact me, my email is alan@sfu.ca. We'd be glad to answer questions. And well, have a healthy 2023. Thank you.